Good evening, everyone. I'm Krista from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight on behalf of our board and our founding institutions, the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. This is our first just-in-time event on free speech and human rights, and we ask the question, have commissions or the media gone too far? Before we get to that, I just would like to draw your attention to the evaluation sheets you have in front of you. Your feedback is really important to us at CCEPA, and if you could fill those out at your leisure throughout the session or at the end, that would be hugely helpful for us. Moderating tonight's event is Halifax lawyer Kevin Kindred. Kevin?
Thanks, Chris. I want to welcome everyone tonight and to thank CCEPA for holding this debate. I really admire CCEPA as an organization because they're committed to seeing important public policy issues aired publicly in forums like this that are fair and balanced, and giving you all the opportunity to have open discussion about them. For this debate in particular, CCEPA has put a lot of energy into getting a smart and balanced panel to share their views on this topic, a topic that's important and also somewhat volatile, or can be somewhat volatile. I'm honored to have been asked to moderate tonight, but I have to say a word or two about the role of an impartial moderator. So if you know me from outside this event, in my real life, I'm a lawyer and I'm a human rights activist, and you could probably use a lot of adjectives to describe both of those roles, but I'm not sure that you would pick moderate or impartial. Neither of those two jobs necessarily prepare me for the job of keeping my opinion to myself, but luckily for me and for you, CCEPA has assembled a panel of experts on this issue, which is impressive in and of itself to the point where I think my only role really is to sit back and make sure that you get a chance to hear from each of them equally. So that's my role tonight, to keep the debate focused, keep it moving, keep it respectful, and hopefully to keep it interesting. And to introduce you a little bit to the topic that we're here to talk about. So what are we here to talk about? Earlier tonight, I called it the perfect storm of public policy issues because it involves a lot of things that we hold near and dear. So human rights and protecting the vulnerable. It involves fundamental freedoms, protecting us all from oppressive powers of government. It involves free speech, and it directly involves the media and their role in our society. And by its very definition, the topic involves speech that some find offensive and controversial. So no wonder, with all of those factors in play, that this is a debate that's attracted such impassioned views from all sides. I can set the stage a bit by referring to three legal cases which find themselves at or near the center of the public debate of this issue. They're certainly not the only cases that we could talk about, but I thought we could refer to three that lay sort of a good foundation for the discussion. So and I'm just going to give you the essential facts, and if the panelists decide to pick up on them, that'll be up to them. First, a case involving Pastor Stephen Boisson, who's a Christian pastor in Alberta, wrote a letter to the editor of the Red Deer Advocate in 2002, which was critical of what he would call the gay agenda. Some phrases that were published in this letter included referring to gays as perverse, self-centered, and morally deprived individuals who are spreading their psychological disease, and as immoral as the pedophiles, drug dealers, and pimps that walk our streets. And the letter ended with, "It's time to start taking back what our enemy has taken from you. The safety and future of our children is at stake." So a man named Darren Lund complained to the Human Rights Commission in Alberta about the publication of this letter, and ultimately the commission found that, ultimately Boisson was found in violation of the Human Rights Act. His penalty included a $5,000 fine, a forced apology, and a prohibition on publishing future disparaging remarks about gays and homosexuals. Another case, this one involving the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, a man named Craig Harrison was a poster on a website called Freedom Site, a website frequented by white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. His comments included things like, "I call on my white brothers to rise up and kill non-whites because God gave Canada to the white man. God says rise up and kill all whites who date blacks. And if you are not white, then you are not allowed in Halton Hills. If you come here, God has told me to kill you." After a complaint from a man named Richard Warman, who was a frequent complainant on hate speech issues, the tribunal declared that Harrison had violated the act and ordered him to pay a fine of $1,000. And finally, maybe the most well-known of recent cases on this issue involves Maclean's magazine. In this case, 3 Muslim students grew increasingly offended by what they saw as an anti-Muslim slant in certain articles in Maclean's. And the breaking point seems to have been a column by Mark Stein called "The Future Belongs to Islam," and Maclean's refusal to allow a counter-article to be published. Complaints were brought to the commissions in Ontario and BC as well as the Federal Commission. The media attention to the complaints was, to say the least, intense. And all 3 complaints were ultimately dismissed, 2 without ever going to a hearing. So 3 somewhat different cases with different facts and different results, but these 3 and cases like it kind of form the core of what we're talking about here tonight, illustrate, I guess, the conflict that's perceived between freedom of speech and protection of human rights. And of course, a lot of cases and a resulting onslaught of attention in the mainstream media and the blogosphere. It must be said, most of that attention highly critical of human rights commissions. So thus the debate. Some arguing that commissions have gone too far, violating free speech and putting a chill on discussion of controversial topics. Others arguing that when properly understood, away from media spin, the commissions play an important role in preventing the spread of hatred. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Here's how we're going to talk about it. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make an opening statement so that you know basically where they're coming from on the issue. And then I'm going to invite them into a debate with each other by asking some pointed questions that arise out of their comments. And then it's going to be turned over to you. We want to give you the opportunity to participate in this debate and to steer it by asking the panelists questions of your own. So in order to do that, I have to ask each of you to be respectful of the event and respectful of one another by keeping your comments brief and appropriate in tone. Brief is important. I recognize sometimes a question requires context and background, but if within 30 seconds to a minute you don't seem to be headed on your way to a question for the panelists, it's my job to make sure that you get there. There aren't mics. I was going to threaten to cut off your mics, but I guess there aren't mics for you to speak at. So we'll be doing that by a raise your hand, and I'll call on you from the crowd. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, and that's how. Now it's my job to introduce you to the who, to the people that CCEPA has brought together to present this issue for you tonight. So, starting with Dan Lazier. Dan is Director of News Content at the Halifax Chronicle Herald and has been with the Chronicle Herald since 2005. His work experience includes 15 years at CBC Television and time with the Canadian press in Halifax, Newfoundland, and in Ottawa. Dan's an Atlantic Journalism Award winner and a Gemini winner, and I would say a passionate advocate for freedom of press, and has written about this issue from that perspective. Next, I'll introduce you to Krista Daly, Director and CEO of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. Krista is a lawyer by training and has come home to Nova Scotia this year after spending many years addressing human rights in the context of refugees, most notably as Senior General Counsel for the Canadian Immigration and Refugee Board and as an advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. And next, Dr. Mark Mercer, who's Professor of Philosophy at St. Mary's University. Or those of us who read his column in the St. Mary's Journal know him a little bit better as the cranky professor. Mark's been a participant at CCEPA debates in the past, and he brings an academic perspective to the debate, but also a keen ability to address the issue in a smart and accessible way, as we can see in several of his articles and columns on the topic that have been picked up by the press both locally and nationally. And finally, Pearl Eliadis, human rights lawyer who joins us tonight from Montreal. Pearl's a graduate of McGill and Oxford who works in the field of human rights both in Canada and as a consultant internationally. She's been working in, with, and occasionally against human rights institutions for over a decade. And her most recent contribution to this debate is a piece entitled "The Controversy Entrepreneurs," published this fall in Maisonneuve magazine. So, with this illustrious panel and 4 people I'm sure chomping at the bit to speak to you, I have to fall back into my role as moderator. I feel a little bit like, with 4 such powerful voices, a bit like the moderator at the federal leaders debate. Except not everyone's sitting around the table, and I don't have the risk that you're going to tune me out to watch the American debate halfway through. So without further ado, I'd ask the panelists to start with opening statements, and to start off, I'll ask them to speak in the order that I introduced them, so we'll start off with Dan.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to CCEPA for giving me the opportunity to participate in this tonight. And you said there were powerful voices. I've got getting over a bit of a cold, so my baritone won't be at its full peak tonight. Also on the topic of experts, I recognize the vast expertise of the other members of the panel here, but I'm not really an expert in human rights. I'm a journalist. We tend to be generalists. What I write about myself ranges over mostly politics and things like that, but as someone who is responsible for the daily journalistic output of a newspaper, of course, the preoccupation with freedom of expression, freedom of speech, is something that is front and center every day. You can't imagine the number of phone calls, emails, and other things I get demanding that our journalists, pull their punches or favor some cause. The special pleadings are a daily occurrence in my business. However, one of the best things about being in a democratic media environment and spending my career there is the sort of fact that it is a marketplace of ideas, a daily marketplace of ideas, and there are markets for all kinds of ideas, and some people don't like that. The strange thing also about this, as a generally small L liberal individual who does believe in respect of people of all races, genders, and whatever other distinctions you want to make, I'm very uncomfortable sometimes with the friends that I have to make when I'm defending freedom of expression. In fact, I hate my friends when it comes to freedom of expression, it seems. The people who gravitate to my cause, if you will, are people that I would never eat lunch with. I certainly wouldn't go for a walk in the park with, and I would never introduce them to my daughters. But all the same, there are some things that we have in common, and that is that we at least have the philosophical agreement that free speech is an essential part of our democracy. I could not function as editor of the newspaper unless this were to remain in place. So all that said, there have been some notorious cases in recent times, some of which we've played some small part in and some a larger part. Going back to the infamous Danish cartoons issue, there were a lot of people, including Mark, who felt that the Chronicle Herald should have published these cartoons. I looked at them. They weren't funny. We didn't own them. So, in other words, we had no claim to protecting the copyright or the expression of these people who I've never met before, these Danish cartoonists. So I just saw no reason whatsoever to print them. If you really were that interested in seeing a bunch of really quite bad and not funny cartoons, then you could go online like you can for anything else and go look them up. Good luck to you. Our own brilliant and award-winning cartoonist, Bruce McKinnon, has occasionally hurt people's feelings. He's paid to hurt feelings. A lot of people don't understand that. Cartoonists are supposed to make you feel uncomfortable, and they're supposed to prod away. They're supposed to get in there in places that the conventional journalists, like myself, aren't really allowed to, or not that allowed to, or that we don't go. There's no easy way to get to those places where you can dig this pencil in and bother people between the ribs. We have to be really, really talented at that, and that's why we leave those kinds of things to cartoonists. And the amazing thing is often people will complain about the cartoon and then later on try to find out if they can get their own autographed copy of it. And I wish Bruce were here. He could verify that. But many people here know that one cartoon that we printed came to the attention of the Center for Islamic Development here in Halifax. It became one of those media things. They popped up on the radio, and I was trying to call them, and one thing and another. Finally, when we were able to get everyone together in a room, we actually sat down and had a tremendous conversation. And I understood where folks were coming from a lot better, and they understood where we were coming from. And at the end, we were all shaking hands and promising to keep in touch. I think that's the great Canadian way of doing things, and maybe that's my sort of unsophisticated way of looking at it. I will say this. In my business, freedom of speech is not an abstraction. It's not a bunch of laws. It's nothing that's airy-fairy or subject of philosophical debate. It's a daily brass tacks issue. So I defend it, even if sometimes I don't like the people I'm defending. The other thing is, I do believe that part of the reason this has become so intense lately is because of the effect of the internet. The anonymity of email that allows people to send hate to me and many other people with utter impunity. I can't find them on the street to punch them in the mouth. So they can do what they want, they can say what they want, and they can be as cowardly as they wish and sound like they're big guys while they're writing from their mother's basement on their little computers. So, and I also, just final one thing to say, I mean, the histrionics of people like Stein and Levant, I mean, go and have their fun. They are still making, and I think Pearl made this point quite well in her recent article, they've got a job to do. They mostly are freelancers. Controversy is great for journalists. So I'm not surprised to see it happen. What I am surprised is that people take it so seriously.
Thank you, Dan.
Quite all right.
Krista.
It's a bit of a hard act to follow there. I'd like to once again and also thank CCEPA for this event, for sponsoring this. I think it's a very, very important event. And the topic of this is really this juxtaposition between freedom of expression and human rights. And the way that I've been looking at this issue is that, in fact, freedom of expression is a human right. That is one of the fundamental human rights that each of us has as internationally and nationally. And so I don't see the two as being in conflict with each other, and I don't think they should be set up as being in conflict with each other. I think they need to reconcile one with the other, and in fact, I believe that they do. I think that Canada has chosen a very sophisticated model of human rights, and in the words of David Matus, who does some work for B'nai B'rith, he comments that the human rights system in Canada is a quilt. All of these rights somehow or another have to intertwine with each other and interconnect, and that if you start pulling one of the rights out and giving it primacy over the others, that the whole thing is going to start to unravel. And that really, in one sense, I think, is a magic of a democracy that we've chosen here. And having worked with some countries which are fledgling democracies, I can say that it's quite a gift, that idea that all of our rights are interconnected. But what is really the connection between the freedom of expression and the right that we look at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission is to be free from discrimination? And the interconnection is that the words, whether they are written or spoken, can in fact discriminate against various groups within our society. And we see that through racial slurs, we see that through sexual harassment in the workplace. And it really has two impacts. The first impact would be on the individual, that the individual loses self-esteem and self-doubt can bring in. And I would argue that leads then to a diminution in the dignity of the person and their inherent right to be a full participant in our society. The other aspect is that the people that read or listen to these words also begin to develop stereotypes and perceptions and prejudices against that individual or that group of persons, which can lead to people not getting jobs, not getting accommodations, not getting services, and in the worst case scenario, actually being subject to violence. So and at the same time, freedom of expression is also one of those fundamental values, and we have to figure out a way to determine at what point perhaps does that freedom of expression step over a line into an area which would cause a discriminatory effect and hate and contempt against some of the targeted groups within our society. That process, and there are many factors that we would look at if we were at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, if they've been founded in law, and it's a very structured process. It's not an arbitrary decisions that are made, and all in accordance with the law. But all of that, I think, still begs a question that's been on the table in all of this, which is what is the role of a Human Rights Commission in this? Some of the discussion around has been, well, maybe it should be left to the criminal law, maybe it should be left to the courts generally. And so I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes on what is the advantages and what are some of the benefits of a Human Rights Commission looking at these issues and trying to do that balance between freedom of expression and freedom from discrimination. A commission, and whether it's a Nova Scotia commission or commissions across the country, have been in existence for a very, very long time, at least for about 4 decades, most of them, and really have a great deal of expertise in the area of discrimination, and in particular the historical context of some of the most discriminated groups in our society. And that would certainly be true here in Nova Scotia. And that really just comes about from years and years and years of working on cases and understanding the historical context that some of these groups have lived in. The other aspect is that a commission is actually a simpler process and a more effective process, I would argue, than a criminal court or the other civil courts, and certainly should be a cheaper and a more cost-effective process. And the other aspect is the fact that a commission actually has a more, I don't know what the right phrase, a greater flexibility in the type of remedies that it could resolve. So we're not actually supposed in this part to comment on what other people have said, but Dan's comment about that they actually sat down with a group and discussed the issue would be something, for example, that a commission could facilitate, and as opposed to a criminal court, which would find one person guilty or innocent, and convictions would arise from it. A commission has the ability to facilitate discussions, to have a much broader range of resolution tactics as opposed to the criminal law or the civil law. I actually just got advised that my time is almost up. It's amazing how quickly it goes. You wonder what you're going to talk about, and then it goes by very, very quickly. But I really just wanted to cover off the 2 points, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A, but really the idea of discrimination and that interconnectedness with freedom of expression, and also the aspect of the benefit of a commission looking at this as opposed to only recourse to the criminal courts or to the other civil courts.
Thank you, Krista, and then Mark.
Thanks, Kevin. Etienne, my 8-year-old son, and I were reading about the French Revolution a few nights ago, and we came to the Terror. And Etienne said, but, stammering under emotion, they were called the Committee for Public Safety. Okay, the Human Rights Commissions. I'm not so sure. I don't think it matters whether human rights commissions are behaving well under their mandate, a mandate from the government. 112 cases having to do with speech is what I read in the Maisonneuve article. That's 112 too many. No one in Canada should be subject to government censorship, suppression, or punishment for expression. Wide freedom of expression is wonderful. It's wonderful for many reasons. It enables us to be candid with each other. It's good for research and the dissemination of information and opinion. It's fun for entertainment. It's good that we can talk to each other freely and entertain each other how we will. It allows people to get things off their chests, and that's great. But there are 3 central reasons why we ought to enjoy wide freedom of expression in Canada. The first is that life is worth living only if you have something that matters to you, something that you care about. We're social creatures. It matters to us that some people, maybe only the people close to us, maybe only a select few, know what we're about, know what we're thinking, know what we're saying. That's one reason. We're social creatures, and it matters to us what we think and what we feel, and we like to let others know. The second reason has to do with consent of the governed. A government is legitimate only if the people subject to that government consent to that government. That is, they can consent to be ruled against their interests. You can't consent to being governed if you haven't had a fair opportunity to influence that government. If you are forbidden to say certain things or express certain emotions, then you are not in a position to give consent when the government says, well, comes in with a policy that you object to. So consent to the governed, that's the second reason. The third has to do with respect for individuals and their autonomy. Telling someone to shut up, right, is to treat them as a child, is to treat them, well, it's not to treat them well as a child, but certainly not to treat them as an adult. It's not to allow them to find their own way of life for themselves. If we're to correct them, we have to correct them through argument, evidence, and example. Otherwise, we're treating them disrespectfully. But don't we need to balance these things against other things, I hear Pearl and Krista say. There are other things that matter to us. Well, first of all, if you are not appalled when you learn that someone was shut up by an official, then you don't value freedom of speech. You might, in the end, say regretfully, oh, it's the sort of thing that has to be done in this case. But if you're not immediately appalled, and if you don't regret doing that, then you don't, in fact, value freedom of speech for one of the three main reasons I've listed. Now, people, I agree, should be able to live their lives without hearing vilification or abuse or hatred. That's a social project for us. Social projects for us include extending equality, extending fairness, prosperity. These are things that matter to us and that we should work hard to get. People need to be protected against harmful discrimination and violence, protected against harmful discrimination and violence with criminal penalties. Now, if you think that speech, expression, can create harmful discrimination or violence, and thus is properly restricted in some cases, you'll want to say that there are three conditions under which restriction is legitimate. One, the problem addressed by the restrictions has to be a real problem. Two, the means have to be effective. That is, there can't be better means to your end than restricting speech. And third, the restrictions themselves can't create worse problems than the problem you're trying to solve. Section 13 and other restrictive pieces of legislation fail at least the last two, probably all three of these conditions. The first condition, again, is that the matter be serious. Yes, indeed, some people in Canada are reasonably afraid for their safety or well-being in virtue of some group membership. And that's terrible, and that has to be addressed. These people, for these people, one might say, yeah, it's just being offended. That's not the real problem. There's something more going on. But wait a second. It's not discrimination in speech. It's the violence or the actual discrimination that they face, and that's what our target should be, not speech. Now, there's no, second point, there's no empirical evidence that laws against racist speech or whatever are effective against actual discrimination. I know only of two studies. This matter is grossly understudied. I know of only two studies, and both of them were inconclusive. And indeed, the way the commissions work now, publicity and getting the ideas out works against that. Third, the restrictions don't apply only to the real haters. We're seeing that in cases now. They've created a chilly climate for expression, and that's a serious bad thing. We need less fear of being punished for our speech, not more. Now, it's in our power to lessen the effects of speech by reacting to the meanings, by taking a dispassionate attitude, by understanding things and reacting on the basis of our understanding. That's a task for the press and universities. We're failing. We could do better, but that's where the work is. Krista and Pearl want that we find words harmful. We don't want to find words harmful. An open and democratic society is what we want, and the first order of business, one of our first orders of business is getting rid of Section 13 and other restrictions on speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, we'll hear from Pearl.
I'd like to thank the organizers for setting this up. It's good to see all of you. How is everybody? Good? I'd like to, you know a little bit about us. I don't know much about you. How many people here are academics or students? Hands? Oh, okay, great. Media. Thank you for identifying yourselves. People who write blogs, have their own blogs. Yeah, I could tell from the reaction to Richard Borman's name with you. How many people, we don't have a lot of time and I want to keep this as short as possible. How many people instinctively think that freedom of expression fundamentally is a really good thing, fundamental to the lifeblood of our democracy, part of what makes us human? Great. I used to do primate studies before I did law. And I worked with chimps. And then I went down the evolutionary scale and went into law school. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I moved from primates to humans was how much we, as two species, share the idea of communications as being fundamental to everything we do. And I'm in the difficult position of agreeing with most of what I've heard from all three of you, but it won't be any fun if I just agree. So let's shake things up a bit. A few things that I'd like to talk about here. The first one is this notion that speech is fundamentally different from and therefore should be protected, distinct from other human acts. I'd like to make the point that speech is an act. It's part of fundamentally everything we do, and you can't abstract or take away speech from the realm of any form of discrimination. Let me give you a couple of examples. When we talk about harassment, for example, in the workplace, harassment at school, racial harassment by law enforcement officers and so on, that kind of harassment can be perpetrated solely by words. Yeah? Human rights commissions routinely accept cases where the act complained of is purely about words, where harassment, and we've all seen or heard of situations where people are systematically denigrated in their jobs, where people are attacked because of their color, they're black, they're white, they're gay, they're straight, whatever it is, and harassed in the sense that they're made to feel degraded, inferior, and so on. And that can legitimately form part of a human rights complaint. So what's different here? What's different here? It isn't the speech, yeah? But it's not the speech, it's the fact that it's been published, written down, and in this case, especially in the McLean's case, published by a subsection of the mainstream media. Okay? The speech itself is routinely a part of human rights complaints all the time. What's different here is that it's the media that's engaged. And this is where I think I have a slightly different position on this than Dan, for example, because although I completely agree that the marketplace of ideas is what we're talking about and what makes us a better society, in this case, because the media has a direct interest in the outcome of this debate, because they themselves have been put on the stand, as it were, they themselves have constrained the marketplace of ideas. The next point that I want to make is this notion, I love Dan's sort of closing line about how the controversy entrepreneurs should not be taken enormously seriously. The problem is that a number of people in the media have taken them very seriously, and the CanWest papers, in particular, the National Post and Maclean's magazine have been running systematic columns on this issue. Maclean's has the largest circulation. I mean, these aren't crazy people with bad haircuts sitting in their basements chained to their computers typing all work and no play makes John of Jack a very dull boy over and over again 300 times. I'm just dating myself for those of you who haven't seen The Shining. But, you know, it is not those people. The fact of the matter is that this is phenomenon that has linked in people with genuine and legitimate positions on free speech. Actually, I think all four of us really, in different respects, has somehow brought into that fold the crazy people with bad haircuts. You know, and for those of you who think that this is not to be taken seriously, Richard Warman, sorry, I'm getting excited here. Richard Warman, who was mentioned earlier, has just had a couple of, actually he's had a couple, but he's recently been the successful complainant in a series of libel cases, where he has been attacked by a number of the people who they themselves have identified him as a so-called enemy of free speech, a pedophile, a disgusting human being. On one of the websites that's a so-called mainstream website, he's been identified as an individual who engages in autoerotic asphyxiation, and that's all he ever does. He has had... I don't know where people have the time for this kind of thing. He has had, on a less amusing note, he has had, 1 minute, damn. He has had his home address published on Google sites with a map, with optimal sniper locations to be shot at. Now, the guys who have threatened to kill him have also threatened to kill senior officials at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and, by the way, have also threatened to kill Barack Obama. One of them was arrested earlier this week in the United States. This has been reported on in a couple of places. And finally, on the empirical issue, there's a great deal of empirical data for those of us who actually work in the field. I've worked in Rwanda, I've worked in Sri Lanka, I've worked working with journalists who are systematically attacked and oppressed in their work. There is real work to be done out there, but the fact of the matter is that there is also evidence of the fact that speech, words, are fundamental human acts, can kill, and or hurt or severely damage. And so I am completely in support of freedom of speech. It is a fundamental human right. But issues of libel, ethnic cleansing, incitement to genocide, incitement to hatred, those kinds of things do need to be carefully watched. We need to be vigilant. We need to be careful. And as a society, I think we need to care. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl. And it's a hard job to pass those 1 minute notes. That's why I got Krista to pass yours to you. Well, there are any number of points that you've all made that I could pick up on as the first question. But maybe the first question should start someplace more fundamental. So I think, Mark, I'm going to direct it to you as the first question. But certainly you're an advocate for a very broad definition of free speech. But some of the things that Pearl mentioned, there are laws against libel, harassment, incitement of genocide. There's an extreme edge of the speech that people encounter. So I want to ask you, should we draw a line, and if so, where should we draw a line around freedom of speech? It's as broadly as I think I could phrase it.
We're talking about Canada, not Sri Lanka. We're talking about Canada, not Rwanda. I don't know that the Tutsi Hutu problem is about to take us over here. I don't want to minimize the fear that, gays and others live in some parts of Canada, but certainly restricting opinion or feeling, even feelings of hatred, even vile feelings, isn't going to help. It's not. I don't see that it's effective. It's not effective in bringing marginalized groups into the mainstream. The marginalized, the disadvantaged need jobs, education, housing. They don't need protection from hate. And in trying to protect them from hate, we've chilled the possibility of discussing candidly what really we ought to do. And I don't know that. Harassment by words. It's not the words that harass. It's the being there. I don't say anything at all. I follow you around closely. That counts as harassment. I mean, that's what ought to be prosecuted, and I think it ought to be prosecuted criminally. Now, have I answered your question?
If I could characterize or mischaracterize, it's a fairly radical position in favor of free speech with very few government limitations. Would I be okay to characterize it that way?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, having characterized it as a very radical view, responses, to the idea not to paraphrase you, but the idea that really we're best as a society when speech goes entirely unrestrained by government.
Well, as a rule, of course, speech should generally go unrestrained by government. I mean, that should be our starting. That's what makes us different than Rwanda and Sri Lanka and so on, right? Is that our default position has to be liberty. That has to be the starting point. So I agree with that. I'm interested in How many people here think that that libel is okay? How would you feel about removing the laws on libel? How many people here think that removing the laws on libel, leaving aside Dan, he's not allowed to answer that question. How many people here think that removing the laws on libel would be a good idea? Anyone's allowed to say anything they can about anyone else? Hands. Just removing the laws on libel. There's a brave one. Okay, good for you. Come on. 2, 3, come on. Okay, 3 out of, 180? We have laws in this society because they distill and crystallize into a set of rules the way in which we want to interact with each other as human beings. And there are certain kinds of statements that, as a society, we have agreed are completely unacceptable. Canada signed in 1976 the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 19 states clearly that there shall be freedom of opinion, there shall be freedom of speech. This is a fundamental human right, with 2 exceptions: the rights and reputations of others. We have been signatories of that convention for 32 years. The rights and reputations of others. Those are the 2 exceptions. Those are the exceptions that are included in Section 1 of our Charter, our Constitution, which are very similar to the 3 exceptions that Mark, when he was putting fences around his argument, pretty much are exactly the same as, with it, that you have rights but with reasonable limits. That's the law of this country. That's what the Supreme Court has said in defending and upholding Section 13, not because it's a law that allows you to complain because you've been offended. No. It's because it's a law that allows you to complain when your rights have been infringed in extreme cases. So that's the area that we're talking about, and that, I think, is the point of debate today.
Well, so Dan, it's been suggested that you might be in favor of removing all libel laws, but and I can understand your interest in that. But on this view of what the acceptable limits to freedom of speech are, would you adopt something as radical as Mark's view, or do you find a compromise?
No,
somewhere?
I mean I can't really function in the abstract world of absolute rights that Mark's talking about, and we've had this discussion.
I don't think I'm talking about absolute.
Well, it's something very close to that. In other words, you should be able to say anything you want, anywhere,
anytime. I gave 3
anytime.
conditions. I said these conditions aren't met.
Well, okay. But I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that for people who practically have to think about what defamation and libel means, and I can give you the number of my lawyer, she'd love to talk to you for a price. So she knows all about it. I don't know that much about it. I call her if I'm confused. And but I guess bring it back to these other matters. I mean, defamation and libel is people have no idea what that really means. I mean, the number of people who call up the paper and say, I didn't like what you said, so I'm going to get a lawyer to write you a letter. And I go, well, good, because we're recycling paper here at the Herald now, and that's where that goes. But, I mean, you have to have a case, right? It's a law. There are laws that has to, defamation has to fit within certain parameters, and they're well set out. They've been argued out in famous cases around the world, and we mostly understand that. I have an informal study of these things, and I can kind of tell when I see them. And just because someone says something that you don't like or hurts you or makes you mad, tough, really. You write a letter to the editor. See, we do provide certain remedies in the dreaded mainstream media, which is a ridiculous term anyway, but the mainstream media that we do provide certain remedies. I think that's where McLean's, for instance, went wrong on that case by not, they should not have agreed to the demands of the law students to have some unfettered right of response of X number of words, but they should have done the responsible thing, I think, and probably a good circulation builder, to go out and find somebody to rebut what Stein said in the pages of that magazine. That's what I would have done. And I mean, then you have the marketplace of ideas that we all want. And Pearl could have done it very ably. And and then everything is back to some sort of a balance. And you're not going through these bizarre charades of complaint and counter complaint and all that. Now, I would just for a moment here there was a mention earlier about the process. Now, I was first exposed to this process earlier this year with the McKinnon cartoon, and I heard on the radio that a human rights commission or a human rights complaint was being launched against the newspaper. I couldn't find out anything about that. We went to our lawyer, a senior lawyer associated with our company, and he is a bit of an expert in this area. And he said can be all very quiet. No, you don't know what's going on. They don't have to tell you who's complaining. You don't know what the complaint is. It seemed all kind of Star Chamber and sort of, 1984 kind of thing to me. But anyway, so we were in this gray zone. And he gave us all these scary other examples, the famous CN case where there was a human rights complaint launched against them because there were no women welders. And in fact, no women wanted to be welders at CN, but there was still a case, and they, or IMP locally, the head of the local firm who was told there was a human rights complaint launched against him. He told him to go pound sand, much to his regret later at ignoring the fact that these processes are there. But I think there's that these tribunals fall into this sort of quasi-judicial tribunal sphere that Krista's an expert in, but I'm not. But I mean, like the Residential Tenancies Board or the UARB and or the securities, when you have a complaint against your stockbroker, you go and they have a very formal thing, a guy in a pinstripe suit, and they have witnesses and testimony, and there's people writing it down, and there's advocates on both sides. It all seems extremely elaborate, but you don't have the same protections that you have in a criminal court or even a civil court. I mean, there are some, but you don't have the full dress thing. And so there are problems that are of a practical nature, which is the way I tend to see things, and not quite so abstractly.
So I think that's a natural jumping off point to another question. And Chris, I also wanted to ask you the question about limits to freedom of speech, but I think this is a good point to ask you a question about process. So, I mean, if I could paraphrase Dan's point, is freedom of speech and protection of freedom of speech too important to leave in the hands of an informal tribunal like the Human Rights Tribunal, like the Human Rights Commission process that we have in Canada?
No, I don't think it's too important in that sense. I mean, I think there's different levels of freedom of speech, and that is why in Canada we do have hate law provisions. So people can be charged criminally in this country for hate speech and for hate law, for example, inciting genocide. And that really then brings to bear the weight of the state, the weight of the criminal justice system, which leads to, if there's a conviction, it leads to criminal records, it leads to jail times, it leads to other type of criminal sanctions. And that's a heavy hand of the state that would impose onto that type of speech. But there is other forms of speech, and this is the type of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission that gets involved, that might not be to that level that it requires a criminal sanction. You don't want to make a journalist a criminal and make them convicted for some of their behavior, but at the same time, it is sufficient enough speech that infringes onto the rights of other persons, and that balance is then tipped in the favor of the human rights protection of the individual who feels that they have been targeted by this speech. So the model of law we have in Canada on this issue, but on many other issues, is that there can actually be two different venues to deal with the same issue, and one venue can deal with the more severe aspect, where the state has a large interest in imposing into the issue, which is the criminal law, and yet this administrative law agency, commission, tribunal system, which is meant to be a more efficient system, it's meant to be more effective, and it's meant to be a little bit, I would say, almost more of a grassroots type of a justice system than the formal criminal or civil courts.
So it does have that informality, but I think maybe Dan's point would say with that informality, there are disadvantages. We talk about secrecy, we talk about lack of openness.
You would not want to go to one of these commissions without a lawyer. Okay? You would be really ill-advised to do that, because you can get tripped up on, the things that lawyers are supposed to take care of for you, right? So that's what I'm saying. You're still, the person who's in front of this is still subjected to the same sort of financial burdens or other responsibilities that you might be in a criminal context or in a civil context, i.e. the legal fees and things like that.
Just very briefly on the issue of cost. The first point to make is that one of the reasons why human rights commissions were set up the way they were was actually not to hear complaints per se, but actually to screen complaints. The media have made a number of serious mistakes, and I mean the mainstream media. People who think the term is ridiculous tend to be in the mainstream media. Sorry, Dan. The reason being is because Canada has a very small number. The Chronicle Herald is actually one of the exceptions, one of the few papers left in Canada, I'm told, that retains a relative degree of independence in relation to the large chains. So present company accepted. The media have made some really fundamental mistakes in terms of explaining to Canadians the difference between a commission and a tribunal and what they do. Now, commissions are fundamentally there as screens. Most of the commissions in Canada function as a screen to take in complaints, to figure out whether there's anything to them, and if there is, then it goes to a tribunal, which is an open court. It's not secret. It's completely open. Anybody can go. You have your hearing. You can have your lawyer. You cannot have your lawyer. And the media, many of whom, you've got a 24-hour news cycle. It's hard to get this stuff straight. I don't think this is deliberate, but a number of people in the media have fudged the two together and confused commissions and tribunals with this talk of star chambers and blah, blah, blah. So it's simply inaccurate. And I have heard media in this country talk about, 3 commissions making 3 completely different decisions. Well, excuse me, in British Columbia, which is one of the 3 some of them are talking about, there isn't even a commission in British Columbia. There isn't one. It doesn't exist. It's a tribunal. They are governed by laws, and they act in accordance with that legislation. So it's really important for you, in your making up your own mind on these issues, to look at the underlying legislation. You can Google it. You can go up and see what it says. Each commission is governed by very different legislation. Take the trouble. Go up and look at it. See what it says. Where Dan has a very good point, and I think this is important, is in the commission phase of screening complaints, it's often very difficult to find out, even if it's at the screening phase, the case against you. Because sometimes the witnesses are not disclosed. It's hard to know exactly what's going on in some of these cases. It's a fair point, and I think from a reform perspective, it has to be dealt with. Finally, on the issue of costs, again, this is an area where I don't think enough research has been done in many of the media about this. Most of the tribunals many of the tribunals in Canada, including the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, have a provision in their legislation that allows, and would have allowed Maclean's, for example, to go and seek costs if they, as they alleged in their magazine, believed that the complaints were frivolous. They didn't even use it. They didn't go before the tribunal and actually ask for their costs back, which they could have done. They didn't do it because they said they respected the tribunal so much. That's terrific. But that wasn't the position they were taking in the magazine. In the magazine, they were taking the position that this was some kind of a fake star chamber. So, the technical legal response to the way in which some of the media have dealt with this is liar, liar, pants on fire. I mean, there is a problem in the way the media have addressed a lot of these issues by simply being either inaccurate or misleading about the way in which these commissions function. I'm perfectly happy to have the debate about whether speech should be dealt with in the courts or in a commission. That's a real complaint, but you should not have it on the basis of systematic portrayal of commissions in a way that is dishonest, misleading, or ill-informed.
Mark, you were kind enough to let me know that you wanted to have a response.
Well, I want to ask a question, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Krista, Pearl, what social benefits have been derived in any of the 112 cases of speech prosecution by the various commissions? Who benefited in the Stephen Boisson case? Did Alberta gays come out ahead? Did they come out better? What about the costs, the social costs of these decisions? Aren't the social costs of these decisions real and great? I don't see that the world is any better for having found Stephen Boisson guilty of, having required him not to speak his mind about homosexuality, pay some money. Other cases, Taylor. I don't see that anything of value has been accomplished, and I think that much of disvalue has been wrought.
I think, Krista, if you want to take the...
I'll start on this one. I think, first of all, some of the language that you're using, you talked about prosecution and conviction, and well, but it's a very important thing because those are criminal law words. They're well-known words. We know them from watching television and Law and Order, but we know that those are that's criminal law terminology, and I think it's very important. We don't talk about that. We talk about complaints and whether the complaints are well-founded and prima facie cases of discrimination. I think that what happens when commissions deal with complaints and then tribunals make rulings, I don't think you should underestimate the power that actually has within a culture and within a society. It
has lots of power.
It may appear that, because you're looking for sort of a tangible day-to-day result, but it actually, for the individual, obviously, it has an impact. Often for the targeted group itself, it has an impact. But the goal in all of this also is to ensure that every citizen of this country, of this province, of this city, of our communities, has the right to fully participate in our society. That is part of what we do in not only in this country, but in any democracy. And so it's issues of tolerance, and it's issues of equality and the dignity of the individual and the dignity of the group. And if it's hard in a sense to have a tangible. Like, what's the direct impact? This decision is rendered today, and this is the benefit that is met. Societal change and changes in tolerance is incremental, and I often phrase it in my own and think of it in my own mind as being almost a ripple effect. You know, one person is brought closer into the society and into our culture, and then that has a ripple effect as they impact in their own family and their own community, et cetera, and in my utopian world, at some point we actually have a society where each person, regardless of their race, color, and creed, are actually full-blown members of our society, and I would argue can fully participate in our society, which will enhance the freedom of expression and this idea of marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas today, some would say, has like one stall in it. It's not a marketplace. Like, I have, once again, a vision of a marketplace where people are chatting and talking, and every stall has different things, is selling different wares. Maybe there's only one stall today, because not everybody is a part of that, because they're marginalized with our society, and they're not actually part of our full Canadian society and what we think it should be.
So,
before you respond, the question was for Krista and Pearl, so I just want to check with Pearl to see if...
I'm hearing half of your response, Mark, as you're trying to respond to through Krista, but trying to sort of respond to both of them, I guess at the same time. I'd like to respond directly to your question. Since 1977, there have been, I'm making this up, but 30,000, 50,000 human rights complaints filed with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. 112 of those, 112 have been hate speech cases. 57 of those have gone to tribunal. All 57 cases have been extreme white supremacist neo-Nazi websites. Let me read you what was on them.
Doesn't matter. What are the social benefits of closing down?
Hang on. I'm getting there. Just sit tight. Okay. Keep your knickers in a knot. It's all good. It's all good. Let me read you some of what was on this. What do you call six niggers hanging from a tree? An Alabama wind chime. How do you fit 100 Jews into a Volkswagen? Guesses? 2 in the front seat, 98 in the ashtray. Quote, obviously, the Jews are here trying to pass the buck and direct attention elsewhere in the days after 9/11. Well, excuse my language. Them all, that's me, excuse the language, not them. We all know who was responsible, and they will, in caps, pay. I urge all Canadians to take active action against B'nai B'rith and all other Jew organizations. Certain cocktails are very cheap. Death to the Zionist occupational government. The death threats that were issued the death threats that were issued in connection with the free speech issue in Richard Warman did not come out in Rwanda or in Sierra Leone or in Sri Lanka. They were done here, in this country. The criminal aspects of this have been brought, but there have also been civil and human rights cases that have been brought. The benefit of this, I actually have a real concern with bringing criminal law to bear, even against the Keegstras and the Zundels, because it's not clear to me that criminal law is actually, the heavy hand of the criminal law is actually the best way to deal with this. Human rights laws, a little bit like torts or delict, are a much better way of saying to the person, what you have said, or what I have said, depending on where you sit, is not only unacceptable, but it is the kind of statement that we do not believe in our society is the kind of speech that attracts the great protections we bring to freedom of speech. I think our society is a better place without this kind of threat. I think that the kind...
Agree with that.
We all agree with that. Well, we
that
go
it would
home
be
then.
better
We can all
without.
go home. We can all go home.
No, the question is how to achieve this end.
It's very simple. You shut down the venues through which this kind of threat, personal attack, and active discrimination are done. And we're only talking about the fringes. I personally think that Mark Stein, Ezra Levant, etc., should have the right to say what they want. I've read all the stuff that's been under the complaints. I think they should have been published. I personally think those students ended up bringing these complaints in order to make a social statement, but I think the commissions were right to dismiss the complaints. Yeah? The commissions were right to dismiss the complaints because however extreme they were, they fell within the legitimate realm of public discourse, however badly expressed and extreme and whatever else. Huh? But the stuff that I'm talking about, the kinds of things that you're asking about, where's the social benefit? I think the social benefit is clear. I mean, I can't imagine anybody in this room thinks that what I just read is all right or appropriate. Sorry, all right and appropriate are wrong. Are acceptable in any civilized society and should be part of our discourse or should be part of the kinds of things that the media should be engaged in. And in fact, Canadian media are not engaged in this kind of discussion.
Thank you for making that point, because these things that you're reading from, I would never read that. I've never seen those. I suppose if I spent the afternoon on Google and, hate and racism, I could have found all that kind of stuff. The point is that those people have marginalized themselves. Obviously, they're out on some extreme edge of the discourse where ordinary thinking, rational people don't live. In fact, there was a great documentary done by Frontline, I think it was on PBS, where they went to find the dreaded racist swastika boys down in Tennessee someplace. And, it took a team of investigative journalists just to find these guys. That's how important they are. That's how much impact they're having. You can't even find them. They give a speech in front of the Walmart. People are more interested in getting discount tires. And so they're not part of the mainstream media discourse now. I don't think it's fair to associate what goes on in Maclean's magazine or the National Post or anybody else who's out trying to sell newspapers with these types of extreme examples. And those aren't the people that people like me are defending. And maybe they are in the abstract sense of they're expressing themselves. But most people just think they're complete idiots. And they have no impact on the public discourse. What's way more important is what's going on in our schools, the bullying and things like that are tangible types of violence against gay kids, people of color, and the whole range of things.
My guess is that people who have had the death threats against them, who have had their homes put on the Google sites, including, by the way, some of them where they work by much more mainstream bloggers, some of whom would be well known in this case.
By definition, are not mainstream.
Well, the Western Standard gets a fair amount of press, and some of the blogs that I've been talking about have not just been published on the websites of crazy people chained to their computers in their basements. They've been published on Ezra Levant's blogs in the Western Standard. They've been published on the Free Republic, and it is the response. And this is where the issue of hate comes up. And in the in the case that Richard Worman just won, there was a very interesting quote that was made by Worman in response to one of the things the judges said on the death threats, which was, I don't think necessarily that this person is gonna come up and kill me, but I do think he's pouring the gasoline around me and inciting others to come and light the match. And it isn't just the extreme websites that I'm talking about. Let's face it, a lot of young people go up and get their news from the web. People go up onto different kinds of blogs. If you want a lot of conservative news, you might go up to the Western Standard. So it isn't just, I think it's important to be careful about this. It isn't, one of the strange things that's happened in this debate is that the extremists that you're talking about have somehow been allowed to come into a much more mainstream conversation in this country. And some of the things that are being said are somehow, Faisal Joseph, who represented the young Muslim students, said it's become acceptable to cloak freedom to hate in the mantle of freedom of speech. And the kinds of people that you don't necessarily, Dan, want to have lunch with have all of a sudden come into the room, and the freedom that some of them have felt to engage in this kind of discourse seems to have expanded, and people who used to be out there on the extreme have become much more mainstream. And this is a phenomenon not only in Canada but in Europe and in the South. This is not simply about extreme countries. So I think it's important to mention that something has happened in this debate, and I don't pretend to understand why, but there does seem to have been a legitimization, if that's a word, a legitimization of some of these extreme views, and I think we have a real social question to ask about how we manage that, and I ask that question as much to Mark as I do to Dan.
I have to interject at this point. Dan, you mentioned ordinary speaking rational people, and we'd be remiss not to note that we have several of those people in the audience tonight. So there is a point in the evening in which I'll welcome you to ask your own questions and make your own comments. I lied before when I said that we didn't have a mic. There is a mic at the back of the room, and for the purposes of the recording of the event tonight, it's important that people use the mic. So unfortunately, it means some of you may have to traipse your way back in order to make use of it, but I'll call on people who line up behind the mic. So if you want to get in line, we'll turn it back to the panelists. And Mark, I cut you off specifically in order to say that. So
no problem.
If we could go around the room, was anyone here convinced by that? Was anyone here now believe that the Jews are trying to take over our government? Does anyone actually who has heard that going to go out and commit an act of violence as a result of that incitement? The problem that I have with these kinds of complaints being taken towards human rights tribunals and human rights commissions is that, as I see it, the solution to these kinds of outrageous speech is not to muzzle them, because that, in my mind, gives them a kind of credence, because they can wave this white flag of a martyr and say, look at how dangerous my opinions are. I'm so powerful a speaker that the government has to come and try and shut me up with all of their power. In my mind, the solution to this kind of thing is simply to disseminate the truth and to allow a free exchange of ideas, because if people can speak their mind freely, I find that those kinds of outrageous examples are just going to get shouted down and overruled, simply because, in my mind, we have an education system in this country that will allow proper thinking to prevail.
So the point being, if I could paraphrase it, which is what I'm doing for everyone, the response to hate speech is more speech and freer speech. Krista, do you have thoughts in response to that?
Yeah, I just think we have to ask ourselves the question, what if you are a member of that group, and where are you going to find that space to raise that other, your own position? Okay, so you may not agree with these particular examples, but our history is rife with stereotypes and prejudice and through the use of language, which portray certain groups of people as being dangerous or stupid or somehow inferior. And at what point is that group then so marginalized, so out of the ability to express and or even to have somebody else express opinions on their behalf, that they can be brought somehow into the society, and we raise the overall issues of equality and the dignity of the individual. That really is the issue, because I see that as the issue, is because I think that just a free exchange of ideas with no checks on it. And once again, we don't have that in this country. We don't have it internationally. We never will have a full freedom of expression and absolute. But I really think you have to turn your minds, and we have to turn all our minds to that issue of the marginalized group that has been oppressed for decades, hundreds of years, if not centuries, and how do they then get to fully participate in our democracy if we allow that type of speech?
Dan, as our mainstream media person on the panel, I feel like I should give you the chance to respond to Krista's contention that if you oppose this speech, it's difficult to find a vehicle through which to do it.
Well, the problem from a conventional media point of view is that if somebody is off on we'reallracist.com, i.e. in his mother's basement with one computer and all his imaginary friends, how do I suddenly at the Chronicle Herald come around to, providing a forum to respond to some guy that no one's ever heard of? Okay, this happens all the time. I mean, people want us to tilt with windmills of all description, but if somebody were to take those ideas or say something hateful in the paper, or what was perceived by our readers to be hateful or objectionable, we provide forums all the time. Letters to the editor, opinion pieces. You can come in and do an editorial board and sit with members of our editorial board. There's lots of different venues for that sort of response. But it's really, and at the same time, I think the dreaded mainstream media does go out and expose some of these clowns for what they are. And, it makes good copy. The people say hateful things. Other people will want to read about it and go, God, what a disgusting and vile person that is. I totally dissociate myself with that. I'm going to read this every single day while we're covering that story. So, that is the practical way these things work. And but we can't, just because someone's out on a hate site saying hateful things, it's pretty hard for the Globe and Mail or the Chronicle Herald or CBC to suddenly fix it all up so everybody's feelings are just right again. We ignore them.
Mark?
Krista is right just about everything. She draws the wrong conclusion, however. It happens in philosophy all the time, too. So. By the way, about getting published in the Chronicle Herald, I send all of my cranky professors there first. I've been published 3 times in the Chronicle Herald. My column has been published 3 times only. I've written, 25, 26 letters to the editor?
Your batting average is better than a lot of people's.
I think I've had 5.
It's not for you two to fight amongst yourselves.
Don't send us an invoice.
About Krista, look. Corporate control of the media is a serious problem. The problem is people lack access to talk to each other. To talk to each other broadly. Little groups can talk to each other, sure. Some group has a magazine, but I think it's a serious problem, lack of access to media. Now, I don't see how the policies and laws that Krista defends go any way at all towards solving that problem. Krista's also right that there are marginalized people in our communities, marginalized on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, whatever, vulnerable people. And there have been for many years, and this is something we should do something about. But look, people who are marginalized in virtue of mainstream opinion, but the Human Rights Commission goes after the extremists. Wait a second. It's not the extremists who are the problem, it's mainstream opinion. Now, I think more than a few members of Human Rights Commissions see what they really should be targeting and are moving the line so that they can exert some control over what happens when honest and thoughtful people voice opinions, maybe opinions that are wrong-headed, maybe emotions that are far false and vile. But it's the ordinary talk that does the damage. And their method is suppression, restriction, and punishment.
There has never been a case among any of the hate speech cases brought in Canada that were in support of what Mark just said. Not
Stephen
one.
Boisson.
All of the 57 that I just talked about that came off, that dealt with the internet, that were on the hate speech front, dealt with the kinds of extreme language that we were just talking about. All of them. The cases dealing with hate speech against gays, in the Stephen Boisson case, for example, I would pretty much assimilate to the first category of cases. So from an empirical perspective, I told you I'm a big fan of David Hume. I like empirical stuff. I like the stuff that's real. The fact of the matter is that commissions almost never take these kinds of complaints on. And when they do, they very rarely go up to tribunal. Why? Specifically because commissions do not like to or want to push those lines. How do I know something? I worked in a human rights commission for 6 years. I've also worked against human rights commissions, representing clients against them. I've seen both sides of the equation. Commissions do not like and are extremely leery of taking complaints when there is a speech issue involved. They really only do take them in extreme cases. Look at the empirical record. It's out there.
I'd like to give the floor to the next person at the mic.
Hello, my name is Judy Haven, and I teach management here. And tonight, most of my students in the MBA class are here because we've just done a little module on human rights in the workplace. And I found it extraordinary, actually, some of the comments. I was pleased that Dan Lazier said that we should look at what's really going on inside of schools, and if there's homophobia and bad things in schools, we should address it. And then Mark just said, ordinary talk. You're saying that ordinary talk does the damage. Well, I think that we should look at some specifics here. As I tell my students all the time, no talk is worth anything unless you do it specifically. And what concerns me is that we had in this very city, the Halifax Regional School Board, about a year or two ago, Lindsay Willow, who was accused by two other high school teachers, and she was a teacher herself, of being gay, of being a lesbian, and not only that she was having a relationship, an illicit relationship, with one of her students, a 17-year-old girl who was one of her gym students. Now, here is a situation in which Lindsay Willow had no recourse but to go to the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and there was an open public hearing which anybody could go to, and I've advised my students that when there's a hearing, they should go, because it's extremely important to see what these hearings do and how much help these hearings can be to promoting human rights in this province. So let's look at specifics. Let's not talk about some 57 cases of somebody who says bad things about Jews in British Columbia. I happen to be Jewish, but bad things about them in British Columbia. Let's talk about the specific cases that the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission has heard, and where there's been a judgment and it's been exposed in the newspaper, and all these other things about cases that are truly diabolical, and yet you wouldn't call them extreme. Except we have a case now in a high school where people are being accused of being lesbians and where they're being denigrated for being lesbians, and the only way of resolving it was to go through the Human Rights Commission in this province.
So, Mark or Dan, feel free to jump in his response to this.
In the Lindsay Willow case, she wasn't, I don't think, facing a sanction from the school board because of her sexual orientation. I think it was the question of whether or not a teacher had abused her position of power by having a relationship with a student.
As far as I know, and Krista, you can help me on this. As far as I know, there's nothing in the act under which the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission drives its mandate that enables it to restrict, suppress, or punish expression. I think there have only been two cases of speech. One was the editorial cartoon. Nova Scotia's Human Rights Commission seems, in my, I'm a philosopher of mind. I write papers on technical problems that maybe 40 people in the world care about. So I look at this thing and I come to matters like this when I'm outraged. It seems to me that the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission is one of the best behaved. It's certainly not the Alberta Human Rights Commission. As far as I know, I think the meddling in the Turrell case was really unfortunate. that was a matter for the citizens of Truro to punish their elected leaders if they desired to do so. That's their business. But generally, I don't have many complaints, and the cases you mentioned seem reasonable things to bring to a Human Rights Commission.
And you've spoken about two cases, Lindsay Willow and the Truro case, both of which had nothing to do with what we could call the hate speech provisions of the Human Rights Act. So I don't want to dwell on it. But Krista, you've been accused of being well behaved. I wonder if you have a response to that.
Yeah. Well, I take my compliments where they come, but I did want to comment, though, just so that everyone in this audience is clear. Not all human rights commissions across the country do, in fact, have the power or the jurisdiction to look at the freedom of expression issues and to comment on publications and broadcasts. So the Canadian Human Rights Commission has that jurisdiction, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the British Columbia Tribunal, the Alberta Commission, and here in Nova Scotia we do as well. So somebody could lay a complaint with us saying that there was a publication or a broadcast that indicates discrimination or an intention to discriminate. So we are one of the 4 across the country that actually could look at this type of thing and then find ourselves in this balancing between freedom of expression and the human rights of individuals of targeted groups. I can say, just for the record, they are extremely rare in Nova Scotia. Pearl has given some of the statistics from the federal, but at most we would hear we would even receive an inquiry or a complaint, and I say at most 1 per year to 1 every 2 years of many, many more inquiries. So just to have the record.
Corrected. I'm sad to hear that you're not well behaved, or that you've been well behaved, but you don't have the jurisdiction. I mean, that you do have the jurisdiction. That's unfortunate.
But I don't think any of those cases have come up. There's been no sanction against any media organization in Nova Scotia through any of these processes, right?
I will give people a sense of a case that we did do, because I went back to sort of see, like, when was sort of the last time there was a case that sort of went through to the Board of Inquiry level, which is sort of the public level, which means that it sort of passed through all these screening stages. And the most recent I was able to find was actually 1994, and it really had nothing to do with the media. It had to do with a cartoon, not a cartoon, but like on a sweatshirt. It was a company that had done a sweatshirt with a very derogatory caricature of a black woman, and then there was a complaint laid against that caricature. So, and then that was found to be well founded. So that shows you, I think. Well, frankly, I think it shows that perhaps the media situation here is a very moderate one, and that there hasn't been the need to be filing complaints. That could be one interpretation that people could make of the fact that we just do not receive very many.
I think it's worth noting, and I think the argument can be made, that the media in a given society reflects, to a large degree, the values of that society. And we're in this business to make money. I mean, I am not going to speak for those barbarians at CanWest. I work for an independent newspaper. That's almost the most important reason I work there. And we can retain a certain philosophical detachment from the rest of this. But I think our paper and the rest of the media here in Nova Scotia does reflect the kind of society that we have here, which is not free of racism by far. But it is striving someday, I hope, to become free of it through the proper way that this is achieved, through education and enlightenment and culture and learning, and not through somebody putting a poster up or a government passing a law saying you will not hate anybody just because of the way they look. We can't be that far off stream with everybody, with society, or people won't read our publications.
Make one footnote, Kevin, if you'll permit.
Sure, quickly.
The question of freedom of speech and sort of the empirical evidence of the so-called chilling effect that we've heard a little bit about in the media, including a comment from Mark earlier. I just want to point out that Reporters Without Borders has just come out with their annual report on the relative freedom of speech around the world. Canada, for those who are interested, this year, including the debates that we've been talking about, has been ranked 13th in the world, ahead, by the way, of the United Kingdom and the United States.
And with that, we'll return to the mic.
I have a lot to say, and if I had more time, I would probably say all of it. But Kevin,
you don't have more time.
Kevin knows how long-winded I can be. So, so I just want to make a note about process. Pearl, you mentioned that the tribunal proceedings are an open process with no secrets. In fact, shortly after this, you suggested that we Google it. In fact, I did, and we can thank the ubiquity of the internet for allowing me to do that. And in summation of what I found, it basically Section 37 of the Human Rights Act contains a clause that allows tribunal proceedings to be held in secret if the tribunal finds that the safety of the witnesses is threatened in some way. Now, you might be able to expound on this.
That's true in any court. That's true in any court proceeding. You can ask for in-camera proceedings.
Okay, so I just want to make a comment more generally on my personal take on the situation, but it just seems to me that. And you used the words shutting down to refer to, you said shutting down the venues by which this speech is perpetuated, presumably speech that you said you find inappropriate in civilized society. Yes, some of the things that Reverend Stephen Boisson said are offensive to me as a gay person, right? But the correct response is not to shut them down. The correct response is to have an open and public airing of views, however offensive they might be. I should add that no progressive cause has ever advanced without offending some kind of social or cultural norms. You can give it whatever newspeak name you want, shutting down, whatever you want to call it. It's censorship. And as much as I might like you as a person, I think you're a censor. I'm sorry.
So, Pearl the censor, any response?
Well, you raised a lot of really good points, and thank you for Googling them while we were talking. On the point about open tribunal hearings, tribunals in this regard, and not in others, do function pretty much like courts. You need a compelling reason to seek a secret or so-called in-camera proceeding. For example, in child custody cases, for example, if the child is going to be in physical danger, you can ask for an in-camera hearing. Similarly, in a Human Rights Commission hearing, you can ask, if you can demonstrate in objective terms danger to a witness or a party, you can ask, and there is a burden of proof to be met in getting that request accorded. So that's a pretty common feature across the entire justice system.
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
So you're saying that as a general rule, the Human Rights Commissions follow common law rules of evidence and procedure?
Right. That's right.
So why then, in a regular court, everyone is responsible for paying their own legal fees, while in the case of the Human Rights Commissions, as far as I understand it, and I might be wrong, some Section 13 cases are prosecuted entirely by the government on behalf of the complainant, and the defendant is responsible for paying every cent of his legal fees. And not only that, but the Commission can see fit to limit his legal team under certain conditions.
Okay.
When he can have counsel present and how many people can constitute his
Have
counsel.
you considered law school?
A lot of people have said that to me.
Well, you should
think about it. In a good way or a bad way?
You should think about it. You'll forgive me for doing Procedure 101 in 30 seconds.
Or less, if possible.
Okay, here we go. You must have a lawyer in order to appear before a court of law if you wish to have a legal representative. In fact, you do not need to have a lawyer before a Human Rights Commission.
I think it was mentioned that it's very advisable, though, and I think it is.
You've had more than your 30 seconds.
So it's just, I mean, we can talk afterwards if you want. But what you've stated is not in fact accurate. You do not need to have a lawyer before a Human Rights Commission. It's a good idea for the reasons Dan talked about, particularly for respondents. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, you can get your costs both in many tribunals in Canada in the Human Rights section. You can ask for costs if you feel the parties have been abusive, as you can in many in the regular court system.
Krista, I just wanted, it's a question about process, so it's kind of your, okay. Anyone else in response to that?
Add that when we heard through a radio interview and subsequent phone call from a police officer, actually it was kind of funny if you have 1 minute, Bruce McKinnon did a cartoon of Sharifa Macaulay, who's from Halifax, but is married to one of the individuals who was charged, and then charges against him for suspected terrorism were dismissed. So, anyway, they didn't like this, or they were stayed, I should say. They didn't like the cartoon. They went on, apparently someone tried to call me or Bruce or somebody at the paper. We never could find any record of that. But they were on the radio in the afternoon saying, this is just the mainstream media ganging up on the brown man yet again. And this is what happens every single day in every mainstream media publication. It's beat up on the poor Muslims and all that. So I couldn't stand that. I called radio and said, I want to be able to respond to that. And so we got into this kind of bizarre, Fellini situation where I was calling them and they weren't calling me and we couldn't get in touch. And then, so I get a call from a police officer who sounded like he was 9. And he says, Mr. Lazier, I've been asked to investigate a criminal complaint about your cartoon. So I said, Constable, you can't get me for that. Okay? So just, you go get talk to your senior officers. They'll tell you the same thing. So anyway, but we still tried to find out, were we being investigated? No one seemed to know. Our lawyer, though, sure took it seriously. And he called some of us in and scared the lot out of me and the others about what might happen if this goes ahead, how this is going to cost the company, how we could be dragged through this whole process, and if all the bad things possible, and lawyers are paid to tell you about all the bad things that could happen to you, if they all happened, it could have been a terrible burden, a financial burden and we're a small company. So there is a chill. There's definitely a chill. And, I still defend to the death Bruce's right to make his cartoons and Paul's right to write his columns and my right to write mine. But there is something clicking around in the back that there could be a process that we may be subjected to at some point which would restrict our rights to say what we want.
Well, so, Chris, I don't want to ask you about that particular case, obviously, because it's before the commission. But this idea, I'm not.
I can't.
I don't think we're going to get that answer tonight. But this idea that complaints of this nature raise a chill. I wonder if, because you made comments earlier about the limited access to media and the importance of more open access to media were it to be available. So the idea that complaints of this nature raise a chill and prevent people from speaking, does that cause you any concern? Do you have a response to it?
I just question whether and certainly, there's been all of this stuff for the last year about these, and I personally haven't seen a chill. So I just wonder where that evidence is that there really is a chill.
I can't say that 14% fewer news articles were printed because of this. Mm-hmm. It is more along the lines of people like myself who are the senior sort of role in the place, saying, okay, just wait a second now, where do we stand vis-a-vis? Is this going to be something that could get us in trouble? Bruce calls me now to get, can I run this cartoon by you? And he never used to do anything like that. Sure, these are subtle things. They're not burdens. But they are there. They're not intangible completely. Mm-hmm. They are there, and it's partly because just of the strangeness of the situation where you're, if you bump into somebody's car on the street, well, you know who your antagonist is going to be in court. It's going to be the guy whose bumper you just creased. But with this one, it was all kind of strange. And the wonderful thing, and the thing I hail totally for the people at the Center for Islamic Development, is that when we did get on the phone and invited them down, they couldn't have been more happy to come in and talk. And we had a great conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mark.
Could I comment on that? Because I think that's an important aspect of this. And, it's not my business to sort of tell the media how to run. But, that's one thing. But no, in terms of... But this is something, for example, at the Commission, and this is for all complaints. It wouldn't just be for a type of this. That we really, really promote is the idea of conversation between groups. And it doesn't need for the Commission to facilitate that conversation. But the idea, that the media, gets and would talk, as you mentioned, how this matter was resolved between what was it, the Canadian Islamic?
It was the Center for Islamic Development
here in Halifax, right? Like that is almost like a perfect resolution. They felt aggrieved, and you felt that there was journalistic integrity in that, but then the conversation that then allows the relationship to go forward and to understand each other's position. And that I find is a very positive aspect to this, and certainly at the Commission, as I said, in terms of our own resolution of any types of complaints, that's a type of discussion and communication that we encourage and think is the right way to resolve, but to resolve conflict where people believe that there is this balancing need between different rights. So that's just an observation.
There's an area of hypersensitivity, though, in some areas where people are maybe emerging as members of mainstream society. Mm-hmm. I mean, the gay rights battles that were so acute in the 80s and things like that don't seem quite as harsh now. People kind of understand the ground rules. An emerging ethnic group in our society, for instance, people from the Middle East of Islamic Muslims who are moving here and coming into Canada and are learning to adapt to Canadian society and are sort of feeling around the edges of the social norms that are here and are finding ways, looking for ways, asking for ways to become part of this and to in a comfortable way, in a way that actually still respects their own values. And this has happened with ethnic minorities going back through the history of Canada. And it's a challenge for those of us who are the establishment or the mainstream or whatever you want to call it, to find ways of understanding their aspirations and accommodating them in a way that makes sense for everybody.
Yeah. I have to return back to the floor, and Mark, I had told you that you would be able to comment first. So.
Just very quickly, Krista, earlier you said one of the social benefits of the outcome of the Stephen Boisson case is that people are not expressing their hostility and their opinions towards homosexuals. Isn't that chill? Isn't that exactly what we're talking about? I mean, the point of that ruling was to prevent people from expressing their minds, expressing their sincere beliefs. That's what
you view it as a chill. I would think others, including myself, would say no. What we are heading towards then is a greater understanding and a more tolerant society.
People not speaking their minds is not people tolerating others. It's people not speaking their minds. Their attitudes don't change.
Okay, I'm going to... did we lose the young woman who was at the mic previously? Or someone's disappeared. Is there someone behind her? I see people standing at the back, but you may just be looking to escape.
I had maybe a simple question of fact. When you were explaining what you might bring to a human commission, I understand that damage to reputation is a fair reason to complain. But I wondered, supposing you said that I was an ignorant and boring teacher and that no respecting school or college should hire me, that would damage my reputation. But supposing that what you said were true, would I still be justified in bringing a complaint? I wondered seriously where truth came into this.
I think the reputation thing was something that I said when I talked about the fact that the two exceptions to freedom of speech are damage to reputation and to rights. The reputation piece refers to the brief exchange I had with a gentleman at the top of the room. It's actually libel and defamation law. That's the libel and defamation side of the equation, which deals with the reputations of others. Human rights commissions do not deal with libel and defamation law. That's handled by the courts. For the chap who's going to law school, I hope you're taking notes because there'll be tests. So the libel and defamation piece is dealt with by the classical court system. It's the rights part of the equation that's handled by human rights commissions. But let me get to your issue of truth. Let's say, can we do the human rights piece of this because we don't really have time to do libel and defamation? So let's say that your human rights complaint is that you refuse to hire me because I'm a woman. Yeah? And so I file my human rights complaint, we go to the commission. Truth matters because you are then able to show, if you're correct, no, the reason I didn't hire her was not because she was a woman. The reason I didn't hire her was because she doesn't have the requisite experience for the job. And then you bring that to the table and you demonstrate your position. So truth on the civil balance of probabilities is a fundamental aspect of the adjudication of human rights complaints. And this is one of the aspects that has been the most mischaracterized in a number of articles that have come out on this issue, this sort of notion that truth somehow doesn't matter. The kind of case that I've talked about, truth absolutely matters. It's adjudicated in accordance with the rule of law for exactly the reasons you're suggesting, because it's central to the determination of what actually happened.
But Pearl, not to let you off the hook too easily, like the example that you illustrated with was a more pure discrimination case. Wasn't a hate speech case. So,
okay.
Is there a role for truth in the hate speech type of case?
Okay, so let me do the other side of this. The example I raised earlier, how do you get 100 Jews into a Volkswagen, 2 in the front seat, 98 in the ashtray? For the purposes of a hate speech complaint, does it matter that the statement is true? Where I'm going with this is that, Kevin's quite right to call me on it. Where I'm going with this is that when you are engaged in speech that is designed to incite hatred against others, what you have to be able to demonstrate is not merely that I might or you might be offended by that kind of a joke. You need to be able to demonstrate not subjective perception. You need to be able to demonstrate that there's an objective evidence that the comment has in fact incited hatred. That is how far you have to be able to go in order to make out a Section 13 complaint. I'm really glad you raised it. It's a really important point.
It seems to me that there's a confusion that comes up again and again. When we're asked, for good cases that justify the Human Rights Commission or Tribunal or what have you, we're giving cases where there is where the appropriate action is the criminal court. So, we have laws, for example, against libel and against, death threats. So that's really important that we deal with those. So I wouldn't use those to justify the existence and mandate of the Human Rights Commission. It seems to me the appropriate place for those is in the court. So is there something, is there a clear-cut case where we should feel, yes, hey, this is an appropriate place for censorship for the Human Rights Commission that wouldn't fall under criminal proceeding? I think that makes sense.
I just want to point out that let's just take fraud, for example, as an example. Let's say that I defraud you in a contractual matter, okay? You can come to court and sue me civilly, asking for your money back. And that's one kind of remedy, and we have legal processes for that. Certain types of fraud, though, are also matters for the criminal courts. You can have both going on at the same time. So when I've had this conversation with editors in a number of the media, a lot of them have said, yeah, but this is criminal law. Like, why don't we just deal with it in criminal? Well, the fact of the matter is that we often have situations where a similar set of facts gives rise to proceedings in two separate jurisdictions. And I've already said, and I possibly for reasons that might bring me closer to Mark's position on this, I have a great deal of discomfort with using the criminal law sanction for issues around speech. The human rights process, which is much more conciliatory, much more intended to sort of make the person whole. Why did we have a civil rights movement? Why do we have laws against discrimination? Because we have a set of social values around compensating people for the damage that they've experienced. And so I think the Human Rights Commission process is softer. It's less. It's not the sort of heavy-handed. It's not criminal prosecution. It's not acquittal. It's not jail. It's not penalties. It's not. It's about compensating the person and making them whole. So I just want to get away from this notion that you have criminals so you don't have the other thing. They can both happen at the same time for different reasons.
The distinction about whether the almighty sort of blast of justice had come down from on high from a judge might not be there. But if they were summoned into a room, and a bunch of people were writing down everything they said, and they had to have they had a lawyer, and the other side had lawyers, and pretty soon there's process and there's motions and all, that person is still going to be subjected, if you will, to everything the same as in a criminal proceeding, except for the actual technical fact that they're not in a criminal court. I'm just saying that the sanction remains almost the same in terms of the effect it has on the person accused. Well, how is it less formal? What's less formal?
But the sanction is huge. A conviction under criminal law results in a criminal record, possibly for the rest of your life.
Right.
And jail time. And that really is why the criminal law is sort of this, like it's almost like the most important and the most rules-based process that we have, because the sanctions against an individual are so significant. And so you asked what would be an example of one that actually could be dealt with a little bit better before a commission the other. Like, let's imagine that you had, sort of a young journalist out, writes an article, uses derogatory language against a particular racial group, right? And let's just assume that it meets that line.
The copy desk.
Yeah, but let's just.
That's your process.
That's
Yeah,
your process.
that's our process, yeah.
But I mean, why would we ever want that to go before a criminal matter? There's no intent there. There's no ill will in that. It was just a lack of understanding about how the words would be perceived by the Zoom. So that would be a type of one. I'm trying to think of a specific example. Once again, here in Nova Scotia, we don't have a lot of examples, so it's hard to come up with one. I would step back to the example I gave of our last public case, which was 1994, which wasn't a media one, but it was a caricature on a sweatshirt. Do we really think that sweatshirt person should have a criminal sanction against them? But that's where the debate is, and that's where the issue of human rights and being able to live free in our society and to be a full participant without having derogatories and prejudice against you rises. That is the debate.
It's better to be fined $5,000 than to go to jail. Yes. But you're still fined $5,000. And not only that, fined $5,000 by being summoned to a place, not asked to participate in a conversation where you may choose not to. It's appalling.
Well, because we're running slow on time, or late on time, I want to turn to the floor for probably what will be the last question.
Good evening. I have been sitting, listening to the various points of view that have been expressed in this discussion tonight, and the one thought that has come to mind for me is that we're in the midst of what I think is a bit of an intellectual conceit. There is no threat, active oppression threat to the freedom of speech in this country. What this discussion has proven tonight is that that's the case. We're gathering in a public place. We're having an open discussion about a controversial issue. It goes on all the time, every day, in our political discourse, our public discourse. What I think is missing from this discussion is an ability to address how well do we as a society understand what it is to be discriminated against? And I really believe that the majority of people that have been speaking this evening don't have that conception. And I think I want to ask a pointed question to Dan Lazier with Chronicle Herald to maybe ponder a little bit, how well do you think journalists understand the concept of discrimination in Canada? And how often do they consider that when they are approaching an issue like freedom of speech? I'd be interested in hearing that answer, because it occurs to me that Canadians maybe don't understand that concept very well, and that's really what we should be looking at in the course of a public debate such as this.
Well, I'll certainly say that as a middle-aged white guy, I'm not really subjected to discrimination. I'm glad for that. I'm not saying that any colleague in my newsroom, though, the black reporters or people that I've worked with from the First Nations or religious minorities and things like that, I'm sure they all have been, and I'm sure that informs some of their work. But just, I also haven't experienced what it's like to stand in front of a nuclear bomb, but I think I still could probably write about what the significance of nuclear arms, is. So, I mean, it's, I don't know that you have to be beaten down before you can write about something. But one of the qualities that I hope is being instilled in journalists nowadays is empathy. And so that we go out and we talk to people. Hopefully we talk to them long enough that we get a sense of where they're coming from. But any characterization we might make of the struggles they face or the obstacles they've faced in their lives is it's subjective to some degree. It's imperfect for sure. I'm not on some lofty height in the media to say everything we say is gospel. Far from it. I'm reminded every day of our many faults. But the fact is that I don't know what it's like to be Sidney Crosby scoring a goal in front of 20,000 people, but I'm sure I could write about it. And I used to write about boxing, but Larry Holmes never punched me in the face. So I mean, it's a matter of perspective, and it would be a better world if we perfectly reflected the whole spectrum of society. But I'm hoping J School will remedy some of that.
Okay, well, Pearl, do you have a quick comment in response?
I think a lot of what we've actually been talking about in this discussion is about discrimination and the impact that some of this speech has on the people who are attacked. My general experience has been that people who have not been subject to that kind of thing tend to be a little less sensitive to it, especially if they haven't worked in the area or been through it themselves, and that's kind of the human condition. One of the things that has happened and become very clear through this debate is that I think the media, and particularly the mainstream media, now I mean that in a positive sense, have had a lot of learning to do through this process to really learn about how the Human Rights Commission process works. The process is not the way in many respects in which it's been described, and I think there has been a learning process that's had to happen, and also the difficulty that these Muslim students had in just getting their views published anywhere was extraordinary until the pressure became such that a couple of media outlets, including the Montreal Gazette, where I live, finally decided to publish some pieces from them. But they had a really, really difficult time even getting their views expressed. And I do think that this is a conversation that needs to continue, because I think Canada and our Canadian media are getting better through this process at understanding how, in fact, the system works. It was a mystery to them. They get libel law, they get defamation law because they deal with it all the time. But there is this other aspect that's part of the legal environment in which you operate, in which I operate, in which we all operate, that I think we all need to understand better.
Well, it comes to the difficult point of the night where I have to draw the debate to a close and declare a winner. No. Sorry. It's also not like the federal election. We don't get an opportunity to see who won in a couple of weeks. But it's reassuring, at least to some extent, that we found some common ground. And Mark, despite my attempt to characterize your view as radical, I think that we all do agree that there are some limits to free speech.
But there are no social benefits to the censorship that these guys are engaged in.
I think we've at least, respect my attempt to find some common ground here. I think we've all agreed that there's at least some limits to free speech. You recognize that death threats are inappropriate, and maybe you'll leave it at that, but I want to at least call that common ground. And on the other hand, Krista and Pearl have both expressed, some legitimate discomfort with the idea that in some cases, the restraints on free speech can go too far, and that free speech in and of itself is inherently valuable. Have we found that middle ground completely and resolved it? I would be a fool to say that we have. And for that reason, you have the opportunity to continue this discussion at the reception outside. I direct you on your way out to stop and pick up some of CCEPA's other material. And please do join us at the reception afterwards to speak with any of the panelists, to speak with each other, to speak with me, and I'll free myself from the restraints of trying to be impartial. I'd also remind you to fill out the evaluations so that you can help CCEPA bring you more quality events like what you've observed tonight. And with that, I'd like to invite Catherine Mead up to close the event for us.
I'm Catherine Mead, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of CCEPA. It's in my capacity as a member of the board that I have the honor of taking a few minutes tonight to say a few words of thanks. I first would like to thank our truly excellent and highly knowledgeable panel. Thank you so much. very much appreciated hearing your insights into this matter, which is not only important, but it's also very timely. And I don't know if any of you happened to catch on TV today, but in responding to his selection of a new cabinet, Prime Minister Harper actually responded to a question precisely on this matter. I can't say that he was particularly insightful, but my whole point is rather that it was nonpartisan. I'm just saying, but although I see my fellow candidate Ted in the back there, but nonetheless, my whole point is that it is very timely, and that this would be a discussion on the national stage as well as when we're talking the very day we're talking about it on a local level. It speaks to that. So I do want to. Maybe you'll just pick yours. And so to Dan and Mark. Thank you. And also, we'll see which side gets the most applause. And also to Pearl and Krista. The very individualized gifts that we have for each of you. But thanks very much. I would also like to thank Kevin Kindred for his very skillful and thought-provoking moderating. Thank you. Again, another personal gift. I wrapped it myself. I also want to thank all of you for coming tonight and making time and taking your time tonight on a crisp fall evening when there are an assortment of other things that you could be doing, and yet you made a decision to come here, and the level of questions were great, and also just taking the time to be here. So thank you. Thanks very much.